While slavery is seen by many as something of the past, there are reminders, both subtle and explicit, of that institution that remain with us today. From plantations where enslaved people were forced to labor, to statues dedicated to those who fought to uphold the practice. This is Disrupted. I'm Carlisle Brown Dean. In 2017, Atlantic staff writer Clint Smith began traveling across the U.S. and the world to visit monuments and landmarks. He wanted to better understand how the echoes of slavery resonate today. He visited places like the Monticello Plantation in Virginia, the Whitney Plantation in New Orleans, and Angola, a plantation turned prison in Louisiana. Smith wrote about that experience in his book, How the Word is Passed, a reckoning with the history of slavery across America. Clint Smith, welcome to Disrupted.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
This book takes the reader on a journey through various sites across the United States that have deep connections to the history of enslavement in this country. And it includes educational sites, plantations, prisons, and even a cemetery that shows that legacy that persists even into death. Before we talk about those sites in particular, share with our listeners what motivated you to write this book and why you thought it was so important to tell the story in this way.
Yeah, so in many ways, the origin story is that in 2017, I was watching several Confederate statues come down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching these statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway. That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy. That my parents still live on a street today, named after someone who owned over 150 enslaved people. Because, the thing is, we know that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols. They're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy. And public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives, which isn't to say that just taking down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee is going to suddenly erase the racial wealth gap. But it does help us recognize a sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help give us a better understanding of what has happened throughout American history and the ways that certain communities have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout American history. So I was looking around my own hometown, the place that raised me, the place that in so many ways made me who I am. And I was like, well, what are the places that are telling the story honestly? What are the places that are telling the story dishonestly? And what are the places that are sort of doing something in between? Because I remember growing up as a kid in New Orleans and having no sense of the history of slavery in any way that was commensurate with the sort of legacy that it left on that city. New Orleans was at one point the largest and busiest slave market in the country. And yet I had no idea. I lived and played and had some of my fondest memories beneath the literal shadows of statues of men who fought a war to keep my ancestors enslaved. And so, this history is so saturated within New Orleans, but I also realized that it was saturated across the country. And so I kind of began in New Orleans, but I ventured out and started thinking about different places across the South, different places across the North, different places across the entirety of the country to try to get a sense of, well, what are the places that have a relationship to this history? Are they being honest about it? Are they being dishonest about it? How are they in doing their sort of own process of reckoning with the past that they're so intimately linked to? And so spent, 4 or 5 years traveling across the country and even across the ocean to try to answer those questions.
Let's talk about some of those sites as you pursued those questions, because your book reminds us that there's always substance in those symbols, and the meaning of that substance, the feeling of that substance varies based on context. And you open the book talking about what's commonly called Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, but you make the point to call it by its full name, and that is the Monticello Plantation, which is located in Virginia. Why decide to open the book with that focus on the Monticello Plantation?
Monticello, the home of Jefferson, is a fascinating place and a place that I wanted to start the book because I think that Jefferson is in so many ways a sort of microcosm of the story of America, which is to say that America is a place that has provided unparalleled, unimaginable opportunities for millions of people across generations in ways that their own ancestors could have simply never imagined. And it has also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And both of those things are the story of America. It's not one over here and one over there. You get to pick one and not pick the other. It's that you have to hold all of that together. You have to hold the complicated duality and complexity of the United States all at once. And I think that Jefferson is a sort of personification of that in so many ways, right? Jefferson is, the intellectual architect of this country, and he's someone alongside Madison and Hamilton and others. And he's also someone who enslaved over 600 people over the course of his lifetime, including 4 of his own children. He's someone who wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal. And he's someone who wrote in Notes on the State of Virginia that Black people are likely inferior to whites in both endowments of body and mind, as he put it. Who believed that the slave was incapable of love, incapable of possessing or sustaining complex emotion in the same way that their white counterparts would. Talked about Phyllis Wheatley, the sort of foremother of African American letters, the first Black woman to publish a book of poetry in the United States. And he said that her work was below the dignity of criticism. It wasn't even worth engaging with, because black people, to his eye, did not have the sort of emotional dexterity or the intellectual acumen with which to create art. And so I was thinking about all of that, and I was thinking about how for so much of my life, until fairly recently, I think this is the case for much of the country, that was just a version of Jefferson that I never encountered. And I think about how for so long in this country we have been so committed to the idea of American exceptionalism that we have suppressed stories that render us unexceptional, or exceptional in ways that are more unflattering than flattering. And so I went to Monticello and I was like, well, how is this institution that is tasked with communicating and conveying and maintaining the legacy of Jefferson, what version of that story are they telling? Are they telling a two-dimensional story of Jefferson that does not account for his transgressions as an enslaver? Or are they telling a three-dimensional story that holds Jefferson in all of his complexity? And when I went, I always remember I went on a tour with this guy, David Thorson. And David is an older white guy, very professorial, had this sort of large brown brimmed hat and this walking cane. And he was leading what is called the Slavery at Monticello tour. So Monticello has several different iterations of its tour because there were so many different pieces to Jefferson's life and legacy. And this one specifically focuses on the legacy of slavery at Monticello. And David was outlining a lot of what I was just talking about, the sort of moral inconsistencies of Jefferson's intellectual project and his sort of ethics around slavery and other matters. And I remember looking at these two women, Donna and Grace, as he was telling these stories, and their faces were wilting and their mouths hung agape, and they were very clearly unsettled by what they were hearing. And I went to them after the presentation and I was like, I'd love to hear a little bit more about what you thought about David's presentation. It seemed like it really impacted you. And I'll always remember Donna turned to me and she was just like, man, he really took the shine off the guy. She's just like, I had no idea Jefferson owned slaves. I had no idea Monticello was a plantation. And mind you, these are folks who bought plane tickets, rented cars, got hotel rooms, who came to the site as a sort of pilgrimage to see the home of one of our founding fathers, and yet had no idea that he was an enslaver. And for me, that was such an important moment at the beginning of the book and at the beginning of my own research, where it was a reminder that so many millions of people across this country still don't understand the history of slavery in any way that is commensurate with the impact that it had on this country. And it also showed me that I needed it in order to write the sort of book that I wanted to write, a book that tried to explore how the memory of slavery manifests itself in different spaces and the people within those places. I had to talk to the people who were encountering these spaces. Like, it couldn't be my own sort of reflections and meditations on my experiences in these spaces. And I could have written the version of the book that was that, but I don't think it would be what this book is, and what I hope this book is which is a more dynamic sort of experience for the reader to get a sense of how so much of the way that we encounter historical sites is shaped by our own backgrounds, our own identities, our own education, our own prejudices, our own biases, and that is ultimately what come together and create our collective or sort of staccato understanding of American history across this country.
You mentioned how we bring our own identities and our experiences and understandings into these encounters and into the understanding of what happened. And I have to say, Clint, I grew up about 45 minutes from Monticello, which meant that every year we had an obligatory school field trip to Monticello. And I'm not proud to say it, but maybe I am. I got kicked off of a field trip to Monticello in middle school because I asked about Sally Hemings. And I wanted to know, is it true that this enslaved woman on this plantation, allegedly half-sister of Thomas Jefferson's wife, was never freed by this man who said in Notes of the State of Virginia that Black people were incapable of love, but still held her in slavery with that very small bedroom carved out behind his main room. So as a seventh grader, I got kicked off of that field trip. And I'll just say that it was also at the time when Virginia was recognizing Lee Jackson King Day because it refused to have a separate holiday. When you think about how people experience that tour based on their racial identities and those sorts of things, and then in the book you talk about the resistance that the curator says, I'm very aware that as a white tour guide, how people receive this info of taking the shine off of Jefferson is different from how Black guides have been really not just pushed back on that narrative, but in many ways harassed because of it. How do we reconcile that? The need to tell the fullness of the story of Jefferson and others, and the recognition that who's telling the story often shapes how that story is received.
Yeah, no, it's a really important point. What I will say is that what's interesting about Monticello is that they, among all the places that I visited, it's the sort of 8 or 9 places that are included in the book, but I visited dozens of places that didn't end up included in the book that informed how I wrote about the places that were in the book. Monticello is interesting because I think it represents a place. It represents the idea that these historical institutions and historical sites are not static, right? They are not trapped in time. They are not anchored to telling the story that they have always told. That there are new versions of that story they can tell. So, like yourself, I've encountered so many people, who've reached out to me, who've come to me at book talks, who've emailed me, who've messaged me on social media, who went to Monticello specifically as young people, or went, or maybe they weren't young, but it was 10, 20, 30 years ago. And the way that Monticello told the story of Jefferson 25 years ago is very different than how they tell the story now, right? Like I regularly encounter people who are like, when I went, they didn't say anything about slavery. When I went, they didn't say the word Sally Hemings. When I went, it is still, given that, Thomas Jefferson's home has been a historical site and a museum for, 150 years. It is very recent that they have begun to meaningfully interrogate the way that they tell the story of Jefferson. It's only in 2018 that they began having a Hemings family tour, and the Hemings family, Sally Hemings being one of them, were central to Monticello in like really foundational ways. And the great historian Annette Gordon-Reed has her incredible book, The Hemingses of Monticello, which sort of outlines the lineage of the Hemings family and the role that they played in making Monticello what it did, what it was. And it, that was only 4 years ago that tour began, right? And the Slavery in Monticello tour has only been in place for a little bit longer than that. And I think sometimes these institutions need to be pushed. And this is an institution that has been pushed by many scholars, by many activists, by many descendants, importantly. And I think that what they try to do is incorporate a range of different voices in their curatorial process, right? So there are the people like David, right, who spent, David spent 30 years in the military. He lived down the road from Monticello, and people on a tour will, when they see David, many of them see their father or their grandfather. And those are the people who told them the stories of this country, of their community, of themselves, that shaped how they understand who they are in the world. And so now you have somebody who resembles in so many ways that same person, giving them a more complex, a more holistic, and what it can often be a more jarring version of American history. But I think for some people, it allows them to hear it in a different way. But that doesn't mean that Black people, for example, should not be part of telling that story, right? So they also have there are Black guides. But I talk about how it has been difficult for Monticello to keep Black guides and Black docents because, the majority white visitors who come to Monticello bring a lot of, it can be very difficult for the Black docents to not experience their own sort of emotional, to carry an additional sort of emotional labor because of the way that white visitors are sort of, vomiting all of their biases and prejudices and previous conceptions of American history back onto them, right? So if you're the descendant of an enslaved person and you're trying to explain Jefferson's legacy as an enslaver and someone who's only understood Jefferson as being the sort of singular pillar of brilliance and this representative of the beauty of the American project, and they're pushing back against you, you experience that in a very different way because it's personal. Because you're not talking about like America in an abstract way. You are talking about their great grandparents. You're talking about the people from who these folks emerged. So, but Monticello does have like the Getting Word Oral History Project, in which they try to use the oral histories passed down through the descendants of enslaved people. I was just there on Juneteenth of this year, where they sort of renovated the enslaved burial ground, which had not been very well kept for a long time, but they've redone it and they've like restructured how they present it. And it was a very moving experience to see the people who were the descendants of people who had been enslaved at this plantation, who didn't have a real site of that they could go to remember their ancestors. It was a really powerful moment to see them have access to that space in a new way.
That's Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Smith is winner of the 2022 Stowe Prize. It recognizes an author whose work illuminates a critical social issue in the tradition of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. Coming up, we moved to Smith's hometown of New Orleans, Louisiana. It was historically one of the busiest hubs of the slave trade. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Carlisle Larsen. This hour, we're joined by Dr. Clint Smith, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. In 2017, Smith traveled to locations across the United States and Africa to learn more about historical sites of slavery, from plantations that enslaved generations of families to prisons that today are disproportionately populated by Black men and women. Before the break, we talked about the history of Thomas Jefferson's Monticello plantation in Virginia.
You say something in the book that really stuck with me. And you said that there you're always reminded about slavery and the Confederacy. You mentioned it growing up with the street names, the statues, and you talk about the echo of enslavement that is everywhere. Say more about that.
in New Orleans, in particular, I think about one of my old professors in graduate school, the historian Walter Johnson, and he wrote this incredible book about the history of slavery in New Orleans, specifically the history of the slave trade in New Orleans, Soul by Soul. And in the book, he says of New Orleans, the whole city is a memorial to slavery. It's in the roads enslaved people built. It's in the buildings enslaved people constructed. It's in the levees enslaved people built. It's in the soil enslaved people are buried in. Their presence is everywhere, and I think that there are few places you can go in New Orleans that have not been touched by slavery, and I think that that's true for many of these many cities across the country, and not just in the South. I was in Germany not too long ago, because I've been on book tour for a little over a year, and I've talked so much about the book, and people often say, well, what's an example of a place that does a really good job of memorializing their own crimes against humanity in their history. And I would invoke Germany often, in terms of how Germany confronts its relationship to the Holocaust. But there was a moment where I got increasingly unsettled by how I was invoking Germany, but hadn't really spent any time there. And so I went to Germany, and one of the most moving memorials that I encountered is called the Stolperstein, which is translated into English. I'm probably sorry to any German people or German speakers out there for butchering that, but the English translation is stumbling stone. And what they are is a sort of decentralized memorial where there are tens of thousands of brass stones that have been put into the ground, and they are placed in front of the homes of where Jewish people and others who were persecuted by the Nazis and murdered by the Nazis. They're placed in front of the last residence from which these people were taken before they were sent off to the death camps. And so, you'll be walking down the streets of Berlin, and you'll stand in front of a house, and there'll be 2 stumbling stones, and it'll have the name, the birth date, the date they were taken, the date they were killed, and where they were killed. And then you walk a few houses down, there are 4, and you walk a few houses down, and there are 10, and you walk a few houses down, there are 15, and you look at the names, and you look at the dates, and you can see that these are families, right? You see the children, you see the mom and dad, you see the grandparents, the cousins, the uncles. And it's such an intimate memorial. It just gives you, you look at the stone in front of this house, and you look at the house, and you just imagine that only 80 years ago, that there were Jewish folks who were pulled from their homes, sent to trains, with one-way tickets, and who would never return. And when I was there, I was with a Jewish German woman, and she was like, what do you think? She was like, if you all had this for slavery in the United States, the whole street would be paved in gold. The whole street would be paved in these brass stones. And it was this moment where I was just like, what would it look like if New Orleans had a similar thing to Berlin with these stumbling stones? And I was like, yeah, you'd walk down some of these streets, and it would be everywhere. If you had stones marking the places where enslaved people were held, where they were sold, where they were captured. And that was a really profound sort of moment of realization for me, that sort of allowed me to imagine as you say, the way that the echo of enslavement could be sort of permanently placed and marked in that city. And I think about what sort of impact that would have on the landscape of the city, the landscape of many cities, and how would that recalibrate the way that folks remember what happened. I've just been thinking a lot about that.
Part of the challenge of recalibration, Clint, is when I think about the ways that people try to remake these sites of extreme violence, pain, torture, being these plantations, and try to make them into bed and breakfast inns or sites for weddings and celebrations. What do you think of that approach of, as you said, this is in many ways sacred ground that is a massive stumbling stone in American history, particularly in Louisiana, particularly in New Orleans. Is that a way to remake that? Or do you think that it ignores the deep-seated pain and history of those spaces?
Oh yeah, I mean, I had an entire section initially in the book on the phenomenon of plantation weddings, and we ended up having to cut it for space. But I spent a lot of time visiting plantations where people do hold weddings. I spent time talking to wedding planners who either hold, organize weddings at former plantations or refuse to, and talk to them about how they make those decisions. And this is why I think a place like the Whitney Plantation is so important, because the Whitney Plantation is the only plantation in Louisiana, and one of the only plantations in the country. Now there are many more over the last few years that have begun to sort of re-examine how they tell the story. But it is one of the only plantations in the country that sort of singularly dedicate themselves to telling the story of that plantation through the lens of enslavement and through the lens of the enslaved people who were held there. And it's surrounded by a sort of constellation of plantations where people, as you mentioned, continue to hold weddings. People continue to have bed and breakfasts. People have, these massive celebrations or debutante balls. And I was talking to one wedding planner who told me how in some of the former slave cabins at some of these sites, they're now used, those slave cabins during the weddings will be used as bridal suites during the celebrations. And the Whitney is a place that fundamentally rejects the idea that a plantation can be understood as anything other than an intergenerational site of torture, right? They're like, this was, and we don't often, scholars do, so, but the public does not often understand or think of plantations as torture sites in the same way that they do some other versions of this in other places across the world. But they were sites of torture. I think of the scholar Edward Baptist, who writes in The Half Has Never Been Told, and in so much of his work talks about the sort of economy of torture, the way that, especially in some of these plantations in the Deep South, the incentive for these enslavers was to create a system that exploited as much labor as possible, extracted as much work as possible from these workers in ways that can only be understood as like torturous and insidious, like coming up with new sort of like psychological mechanisms of psychological torture or physical torture in order to get folks to work as much as they can. And so how can you have those sites and have them be the place? I don't understand how you can have a site that was an intergenerational site of torture and have it be a place where you want to spend, presumably one of the happiest days of your life. And so, a question that I wrestled with was like, are these people who hold these ceremonies there, are they ignorant to this history? Are they cognizant of the history and don't care? Or is that history part of the appeal, right? Like, is that history, whether consciously or subconsciously, part of the desire to have it there? And I think the answer might be different for all sorts of different people. But, alongside Confederate statues and Confederate iconography, I think that, plantation weddings are kind of like the low-hanging fruit of this debate. I think there are like meaningful good faith debates to be had about whether or not we should have statues of Jefferson, in certain places, whether we should have statues of Andrew Jackson in certain places, whether we should have, the 12 of our first 18 presidents owned enslaved people. And I think that there's a lot of all of those the enslavement that all of those presidents engaged in. Like what Jefferson did is different than what Washington did, which is different than what Jackson did, which is different than what Grant did, which is different than what Polk did. And so it's not to conflate all of them, but I think that people of good faith can have disagreements about how we should remember the totality of someone's legacy. But for like statues of the Confederacy, people who fought a war predicated on maintaining and expanding the institution of slavery, for plantation weddings, again, these like sites of torture where someone would want to celebrate on the sort of, not supposed, the actual grave sites of, these enslaved people. Those for me feel like the parts of the conversation that everything can be up for debate, I guess, but that seem very straightforward to me. And yeah, I think your framing of thinking of those sites as sort of large stumbling stones themselves is an important one. Unfortunately, there are so many plantations across the South that attempt, rather than rendering themselves a sort of stumbling stone, they try to erase any relationship to that history.
That's Dr. Clint Smith, author of How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Smith is the 2022 Stowe Prize recipient. Coming up, the final part of my conversation with Clint Smith will discuss prisons and their roots in slavery. This is Disrupted. Stay with us. Welcome back to Disrupted. I'm Carlisle Larsen. This hour we've been discussing and attempting to grapple with America's history of slavery and how that history has profound echoes that resonate even today. Our guest is Clint Smith, staff writer at The Atlantic and author of How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Before the break, we talked about how plantations are frequently divorced from their dark history. Here's the rest of that conversation.
I am struck and in some ways stuck on that phrase, intergenerational sites of terror, and of thinking about Louisiana and how it's captured in your book, that those intergenerational sites aren't just plantations. They're also prisons that continue to this day as intergenerational sites of terror, but also intergenerational sites for the creation and reproduction of wealth for particular entities. And one of the prisons that you visit is the famed Angola Penitentiary there. And you visited with Norris Henderson, who I believe is unequivocally one of this country's, this world's leading voices and activists on criminal justice reform, even before it was a popular topic to discuss, who spent nearly 30 years of his life incarcerated in that facility. What was that experience for you of going to Angola, traveling that highway that you had traversed so often for the innocence of youth, like Boy Scouts and athletics? What was it like making that journey to Angola?
I could have written a whole book just about the experience at Angola, and many people have, written really fantastic books about Angola. For context for folks, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the country. It's 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 70% of the people held there are black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it is built on top of a former plantation. And what I tell people, to invoke Germany again, is that if you were to go to Germany and you had the largest maximum security prison in Germany, and it was built on top of a former concentration camp in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish, that place would quite rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. And yet here in the United States, we have the largest maximum security prison in the country where the vast majority of people are black men serving life sentences, many of whom were sentenced as children. The United States is the only country that sentences children to life without the possibility of parole, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries, which has since been rendered unconstitutional by the Supreme Court of the United States for being a vestige of white supremacy, who are picking crops, in fields while someone watches over them on horseback with a gun over their shoulder. And so when I go to Angola, I'm thinking about, well, what are the ways that a history of white supremacy not only enacts physical violence against people's bodies, but also collectively numbs us to certain types of violence that in another global context would very clearly be unacceptable? And what does it mean that that place has a gift shop? At the entrance of Angola, there's a gift shop, and you can buy coffee mugs and shot glasses and T-shirts and sweatshirts and baseball caps and stuffed animals dressed in prison garb. And that, one of the things you can buy is on the coffee mug, there's a silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it reads Angola, a gated community, as if to make a mockery of or belittle the experiences of the thousands of people, the tens of thousands of people over generations who've been incarcerated and held there. And I remember being with Norris, who, as you said, is just like a remarkable person. And we were leaving Angola. We were leaving at the end of our tour. And we were looking out of the bus, and we saw these men who were working in the fields. They were lifting their spades into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their shovels into the air and digging them into the earth. And Norris looked at the men, and he looked at his hands, and he had this moment where, his hands are full of calluses from all the years he spent working in the fields. And he looked at me, and he was like, "Clint, I can't begin to explain to you what it felt like to work in fields for 7 cents an hour for years, and to wonder if these are the same fields where my ancestors were working and picking cotton 200 years ago." Right. So for the folks who've been incarcerated in Angola, this history is not a metaphor. It's not a intellectual exercise. It's not an abstraction. They feel this history in their bones. They feel it in their bodies. It is the calluses in their skin. And it's not to say that slavery and mass incarceration are the same thing. They're not. They're a historically unique phenomenon and should be understood on their own terms. But it is to say that the residue of enslavement undoubtedly shapes the way that our carceral infrastructure looks and operates. And there's no place that demonstrates that more directly than Angola.
I visited Angola about 15 years ago for a research project, and our guide was a trustee, so dressed in all white. And he talked about this rodeo that's held at Angola twice a year, the amount of money it generates for the state, but the pride that these men felt that for a moment they felt like they had something they could control. And for me, it seems such a perverted way to think about they're risking their lives for $100 to have these bulls as they sit at a picnic table in the middle of a ring. But it connects to so much of what you said about the ways that the labor of Black people, particularly Black men, in that institution continues to be exploited for the gain of people without any sort of say in that. And it brings us, Clint, to, we're now approaching midterm elections in the United States. 5 states, including Louisiana, will make a decision about whether to abolish slavery in their state constitutions. Louisiana's carve out for that ballot initiative is except for conditions of punishment related to a criminal offense, mirroring the language of the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Do you think Louisiana is moving in the direction of that kind of reckoning? Or is this just a hollow approach to really reconciling those legacies within the state?
I think that most people generally are not even cognizant of the exception carved into the 13th Amendment. I think that Louisiana, like much of the country, has been there, that there has been a shift, and I think to different degrees in different places, but there has been a shift in our sort of collective public consciousness about the way that the way that racism manifests itself in this country. And that is attributed largely to the Black Lives Matter movement of the past 10 years and the activists and organizers on the ground whose work has opened up space for books like mine, for other writers, journalists, scholars, thinkers, artists, to have their work enter into the public arena in a different way than would have been possible before, much in the same way that the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s opened up a new set of possibilities for how, historians did their work, for how writers did their work. Some of our greatest historians, writers, artists, it is not a coincidence that their work is coming out of that moment, because the work that activists and organizers did on the ground opened up space for those kind of conversations to happen. And I think we've seen a similar thing happen now, and that was kind of supercharged in 2020. With that said, what happens and what has always happened throughout American history is, as scholars of the Black experience know, is that any time there has been a shift in the direction of progress, there has been intense pushback and intense backlash. And so, what has happened is that over the last 10 years, particularly in the last 2 years, you've had millions of people whose understanding of this country, whose understanding of race and racism has become more nuanced, more complex, more sophisticated, one that is grounded not in an understanding of racism as just an interpersonal phenomenon, but as a systemic one, a structural one, a historical one, a sociological one. At the same time, that new sense of that new collective understanding that millions of people have is a direct threat to the lives and identities and material wealth and goods of millions of other people. And as a result, now we have, state legislatures across the country who are attempting to prevent teachers from teaching the very history that explains why our society looks the way that it does today. You have school districts who are attempting to ban books that share perspectives that otherwise, that students might not otherwise encounter in either literature or their real lives. And that's not a coincidence. That's because when you tell a more honest story of America, it represents an existential threat to how so many people understand who they are, because their sense of who their own identities is so deeply tied to the previous version of the American story that so many of us were telling, the sort of two-dimensional rendering of America, in the same way that, we talk about the two-dimensional rendering of Thomas Jefferson's story. But when that is taken away from folks, or when people are trying to expand the way that we tell the story, that's scary for a lot of people. And they use whatever they sort of have, economic, social, political tools that they can wield in order to push back against it. And I think the sort of critical race theory boogeyman that has been around for the last couple of years is a sort of representation of the effort to distort what telling a more honest story of America is really about.
As we come to the close of our time together, I want to share this passage from your book. And it's a very personal passage because you reflect on this time you spend with your grandparents at the National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. And you write in the book, "I think of how decades of racial violence have shaped everything we see, but sometimes I find myself forgetting its impact on those right beside me. I forget that so many of the people who threw rocks at Dr. King are still voting in our elections. We tell ourselves that the most nefarious displays of racial violence happened long ago, when they were in fact not so long ago at all." When you think about this history that you have been able to weave together, you think about this current moment that we are in where people are so actively resisting that, whether it's the banning of books, the attack on voting rights, insurrections at the U.S. Capitol. What do you see as a way forward for us, Clint, to harness these lessons of the past, understanding how it continues to affect us, and still create some hope for our kids?
The thing I always think about is how, the first enslaved people came to the British colonies that would become the United States in 1619. 13th Amendment didn't pass, and Civil War didn't end until 1865. So people commonly understand there's sort of 250 years of a formal enslavement in the British colonies and the United States. But what's also true is that from the moment Black people arrived on these shores, they were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for liberation. They were fighting for emancipation. And what that means is that the vast majority of people who fought for freedom never got a chance to experience it for themselves. But they fought for it anyway, because they knew that someday someone would. And I think about that. I think about how my life is only possible, how my children's lives are only possible because of generations of people who fought for something that they knew they would probably never see in their own lives. But they fought for it anyway because they knew that someone, sometime down the road, someone they would never know, would benefit from the work that they were doing. And I think about what sort of responsibility does that bestow upon me? I have all these ideas, like as so many of us do, of what it means to build and live in a better world, a more just world, a more equitable world, a more generous world. And I think about how sometimes it can be hard for so many of us because we sort of work to dismantle these institutions on a micro scale within our communities and within our institutions, and on a sort of macro scale within our cities, states, and the country and the world. And it can be hard because it feels like it doesn't feel like it's moving as quickly as it should. But in those moments, I remind myself that you don't fight to build a better world so that you can necessarily be the one to experience the fruits of your labor. You fight for a better world because somebody fought for a better world for you. And it is our job in so many ways to fight for a better world for the folks who, may not be my kids, may not even be their kids, but like someone down the road will benefit from the work that we're doing in the same way that we benefit from the work that generations of our ancestors have. I think of it as sort of chipping away at a wall, and you don't know if the wall is 6 inches thick or 6,000 miles thick, but the more you chip away at it, the less the people who come after you will have to chip away at. And I think that's part of the Black historical tradition. And I feel very lucky to be part of that tradition. And that's what, when I think of what gives me hope, it's that, that I'm part of a legacy of people who have been so selfless and so generous and so consistent in the work toward liberation and our sort of collective freedom, and that work that we are still working towards that.
Dr. Clint Smith is author of How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. Clint, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Dr. Clint Smith is the 2022 Stowe Prize recipient. The paperback version of his book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, debuted last month. This interview was originally recorded before the 2022 midterm elections. And as I mentioned during the interview, there were ballot measures in 5 states that sought to abolish slavery as punishment for crime. Those states were Alabama, Louisiana, Oregon, Tennessee, and Vermont. Of those 5, Louisiana was the only state that failed to pass its measure. The lawmaker who initially sponsored that amendment told voters to reject it because the measure was written with confusing wording that may not have actually gotten rid of slavery as a punishment. He says he hopes to return with a more clearly worded ballot measure next year. Disrupted is produced by Kevin Chang Barnum, Emily Charash, and Catie Talarski. This episode was originally produced by Carlisle Larsen, Kevin Chang Barnum, and Catie Talarski. You can listen to all the previous episodes of Disrupted by finding us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Disrupted and Connecticut Public. And if you have feedback or ideas for the program, you can email us. It's disrupted@ctpublic.org. I'm Kalila Brown Dean. Thanks for listening.